welcome to my humble abode. Today I'll be talking to you about my 3 lesson plans that I created for our mock EdTPA. So we'll dive in right into our first one. Oh, I guess I should talk about the book real quick. The subject is math, 5th grade, and I used this book called Go Math. Um, it was said that math was going to be really hard for doing this kind of a lot of the work that we were doing in this class, integrating literature and um, using words appropriately in math. Um, but this book actually helped a lot because it's really aligned with the Common Core. It offers a lot of activities and vocabulary just to use throughout the math lesson. So it kind of really helped me throughout the process. Okay, diving into lesson 1. Talking about the objectives of the students. So students will use vocabulary to compare multi-digit whole numbers according to place, value, and function. So this first lesson is really just an overview of vocabulary and vocabulary used with decimals. So as a state standard says, read, write, and compare decimals to the thousandths place. Still gets me sometimes. And then just the theory of Dewey, which is like what he talks about in education of you learn best by doing. So we're just going to jump in using vocabulary terms to better understand decimals. And this is just a first lesson kind of overview, getting students accustomed to using the terminology and accustomed to seeing decimals. So the creative introduction, this is all in the bright yellow for number 4, but just for the sake of us reading it, I typed it in black. So here we go. The main point that I want to bring in this introduction is why we're using decimals. Why do we use decimals? Where do we see this in our lives, especially with cents and because oftentimes, little pun here, it doesn't make sense to us of why we measure things in the way we do with this. So we'll talk about that a little bit, what it means to the students, and then we'll talk about it later in the week as well. So step 2 is to share the agenda and objectives. So we'll jump right into the behavioral expectations, talking about how we're going to be doing a lot of group work throughout these 3 lessons, and especially today, just starting right off the bat, how we should be respectful of others working around us and our partners as well who we're working with. So right into the steps of instruction then. I'm going to model using the think aloud, how numbers such as these given ones, these just examples, can fit in their respective spots. I'll show you a table later that demonstrates this. It'll be shown in the activity, and it labels what value spots, value places are used to understand the values of that decimal place. Right, pretty straightforward. The second activity that we'll do in this modeling steps of instruction is I will pull up a 10 by 10 grid, ask students to help me shade these numbers. These are just examples again, and then think aloud how that we're going to do that. And then I think pair share for how each cube represents fractions. And this is kind of a strong point because fractions was their last chapter that the students just learned, and so showing the decimals can be represented in fractions as well, or just that the value can be represented in fractions also brings home that point of something that they previously learned. Okay, and then talk about how we can use the 10 by 10 grid and other representations to help us count, display, and add and subtract. Not only decimals, but fractions as well. So I'll hand out this activity sheet. And I think the main point again is driving home how have we dealt with decimals outside of the classroom. So I'll go down to the activity, past all of these here. Oops. So this is the vocabulary decoder, and what students are going to do here is scroll through their book and find the words that match with the following definitions. These are clues, or they're the definitions of each word. And the decoder is also really simple because it's just where the letter falls in the alphabet and backwards or switched. So this is actually 19, and it should be S is the 19th letter because I believe this word is sequence. So then once the students have decoded these words, they will match up the clues with the words. These are again just the definitions. And following that, the students will then write their own definitions of the vocabulary terms just to get them even more accustomed and to help them create meaning of the words. Okay, back to the top. Okay, so again, those will be done in small groups and pairs. And to help scaffold this activity, I can provide assistance by adding some letters or even demonstrating modeling through Think Aloud how to go about decoding those. And then if students are finishing that really easily, to make it a little bit more challenging, I can have the students provide or make their own code for other math vocabulary terms that they can either use in this chapter or that they've previously learned before. And then this is only going to be for about 10 minutes that they're going to work on this, and then we're going to jump into the independent practice. Students will have time after the independent practice to go back to that vocabulary decoder if they have not finished, and again that just allows for extra time for students to focus on the content rather than just needing to hurry up and finish, because that vocabulary decoder is not being graded. It is an informal assessment, and it's just going to allow them to refer back to that sheet, again, to help them understand the terms that we're using throughout this chapter. So back to the independent practice. Students are given a worksheet with 4 questions about decimals. These problems will help students demonstrate what they learned about the vocabulary words and how the terms relate to math functioning. So we'll go back to activity 1.2, past all this here. This is our decimal investigation. So pretty much it's more of putting the vocabulary terms to use and showing it how they relate to use with the decimals. So here we have the table I was talking about earlier, one that we've already run through in the steps of instructions then. So they will write numerically this number within this table. Again, they've already seen that done before earlier in the class. Then they will use the number lines to better understand where decimals lie. Using fractions again in relation to the decimals. And this final chart is just understanding a little bit more in depth of how place values or just the value of the place of the decimals. Again, it's very straightforward, but students need to understand what it actually means to be 10 times as much or a tenth of, and we'll talk about that later in the next chapter, and scaffold off what they were learning through the vocabulary today. Okay, back up to the top. So again, that activity 1.2 is also not going to be graded. Another informal assessment to see where students are, where they are coming from, what they've already learned, and then how to progress through these following lessons. So the closer then is just going to be just a quick discussion. Um, this 15-minute time slot also allows the students to finish their vocabulary decoder if they did not before, or to again just continue finishing that activity. Otherwise, we'll have a discussion for about the last 5 minutes of class, talking about these questions of what did you like about the decoder, and then diving into more like problem solving. So what did you use? Did you use the decimals and the decoding um, to help you solve those? Did you know any of these words prior to the activity? And then what words did you learn um, throughout this chapter? What are you going to learn? So after discussion, then just lay out the next lessons and let the students preview what will be happening in the following days. So lesson 2 comes up again. The topic will then be decimals and the values of the place. So understanding that each place has a certain value, and how we're going to be representing that is going to be important for today's lesson, for this lesson 2. So the objective then, students will read and write decimals through the thousandths using different notations. So the state standard then is read and write decimals to thousandths, using base 10, numerals, number names, and expanded forms. And I think that's just going back to this word is going to be tough, I'm sure, for not only me but for students as well. So getting them accustomed to not only seeing it, reading it, but being able to say it clearly and effectively is also important. And the theorist here is Bloom, just talking about the different scaffolding measures that are important throughout the class. So following this is our creative introduction. So again, this is all in bright yellow. I'm trying to make it more applicable to the students and their lives. So we're going to talk about money today, probably the most common time that we talk about decimals. So I'll have $25 written on the board and versus 25 cents. And we're going to talk about why putting 25 zeros or 5 zeros even after $25, 25, so 25,000 or $2,500,000 is different than